And I noticed she had picked a song for today's offertory called Lord of All Time. And that comes from the third book of Ecclesiastes. And suddenly, into my mind popped a sermon I heard in February of 1999 back in Alaska. You'd say, well, why would you remember something that long? Well, I just gotten to Hawaii a few months earlier, and I was told we need to go inspect all our units, so make a plan. I said, okay, so I just wrote units down on the list, and Alaska fell into February. So there we were, going from 85 degrees in Hawaii to minus 30 in Fairbanks, Alaska, and my staff was visibly upset with me. I mean, visibly. You could see it on their faces, and you could hear it in their words if you listened close enough. But anyway, got a few new names that day. But anyway, that Sunday morning, I went to the chapel, and the chaplain there gave a sermon on Ecclesiastes. I thought it was really good and listened to it well. I'd love to give him the credit for it, but I can't remember his name. So some of the inspiration that does come from him, so I have to give him the credit. You know, a few of you in here, particularly if you're in the Memorial Association, you get tired of hearing me talk about having a strategic view. Well, that comes a lot from my military time. We talked about strategic and tactical almost on a daily basis. But I think it's very important that we always keep in mind the main thing, even as we go through our daily lives and make our plans every day. Keep your eye on the main thing. Make sure you're thinking of the long term, because if not, you'll get a little messed up. You know, I recall a speech that was given at Air Command and War College back in the mid-'80s. Yeah, I'm old. But it was a general officer who had flown F-4s in Vietnam. And he was saying that one of the most dangerous missions you can have is a nighttime mission, because sometimes it's just pitch dark out there. There's no reference, and it's very dangerous. You don't know if you're upside down or right side up. So he said this most dangerous mission that he ever flew in Vietnam was on a night mission, and he was flying along so intent on his mission that he forgot to check his instruments. So he glanced down after several moments and discovered that he was not flying straight, he was flying straight, actually heading for the earth. So he pulled up real quick and made it by a little less than 100 yards. And if you know anything about old F-4s, that's pretty good because they don't turn on a dime. So he said that the only way to avoid the dangers of flying at night is to always keep your eyes on the instrument panel. Make sure you're checking your instrument panel quite often. Otherwise, you'll think you're flying straight when you're flying straight. That's not a good thing. He said also that rings true, not just in a fighter jet or for a fighter pilot. It also rings true in your life as you go along life's path. He says you got to keep your mind on the divine instrument power panel of truth. He actually said that. You could say that back in those days. And he referenced the Bible. You know, if there was ever a man who knew better than to fly by the seat of his pants or to use his own intuition to get through life, it was a guy by the name of Solomon. He knew better than that. You remember Solomon. He was the son of King David and Bathsheba. That's a topic for another sermon, but we won't go into that. But he was destined for the throne of Israel right from the beginning. You see, King David had promised Bathsheba that their second son, Solomon, would receive the crown on his passing, probably as a payback after God had taken their first son because of David's sins. The prophet told him that it was going to happen. And Bathsheba held him to that promise on his deathbed. That's another topic for another sermon, because when David gave the instructions to Solomon, one of the instructions was he's going to have to eliminate one of his very brothers. So lots of good things in the Bible, isn't it? As Solomon was growing up, his father had conquered all the lands around Israel, basically ensuring that his son would have a safe kingdom. So Solomon's ready for a comfortable and very powerful life as the king of Israel. Then in 1 Kings chapter 3 records an event that had never happened in the history of mankind and has never happened since. And that is, God came to Solomon in a dream and said, hey, make a wish and I'll make it happen. I'll grant it. Now, this wasn't Aladdin. This wasn't, the genie in the lamp. You didn't get 3 wishes. You only got 1 wish. And to the surprise, I think, of most, he didn't say he wanted riches, wealth, power, long life, any of those things. He said he wanted wisdom. That's what he wrote on that blank check. So God responded in the first book of Kings with these words. It's coming up next. He says, basically, I'm going to give you what you wanted. He said, because you didn't ask for all this other stuff, all these worldly things, I'm going to get you what you want. And if that's not exciting enough, God isn't finished yet. He went on in verse 13 to say, buddy, you're going to get the whole truckload. You're going to get everything. And so Solomon is in for the ride of his life, and off he soars. Early during his reign, he wrote what's called the Song of Solomon. Some of you hopefully have read that. It's a passionate love story. And it's basically about what love is supposed to be about, and marriage. Problem is, same time he's penning it, he's going about personally distorting love and marriage by marrying the daughters of several kings. Now, that's what the world did in those days. But he just got through writing, that's not the way it ought to be. But he's going to do it. Matter of fact, we're told that he married, get this, 700 princesses in all. But they were used for nothing more than pawns for his military power. That's what it was all about. Now, the most prominent of these princesses was the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Think about that a minute. At the time that happened, I think that had to be especially insulting to the power and the providence of God, who just a few centuries before that had brought the people out of bondage in Egypt. And here's Solomon marrying the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, during the middle years of his reign, he wrote and he collected the Proverbs of Wisdom, what we now refer to as the book of Proverbs. Trouble is, again, while he's collecting and writing all these bits of wisdom, he defied the wisdom of God. It's clear from what we can observe in Scripture that Solomon had certainly turned his focus away from God and onto himself. For example, it took him 7 years to build that gold-covered temple to God that he was supposed to build. David left him the materials to build that. However, it took him 13 years to build his own home, his own palace. You can only imagine the splendor of that palace. And just look at the difference in the two. It's hard to see on that slide, but one of them's a whole lot bigger than the other one. 13 years versus 7 years. Perhaps he's lost his focus. He also collected a lot of horses and chariots and all these symbols of military power. And matter of fact, he collected so many of them, he had to build cities just to house his collections. Pretty big. Now, he ended up also breeding and selling horses, and he sold them to the Hittites and the Syrians, which wasn't a very good idea because that essentially provided them the military instruments to turn around and attack Israel later. Certainly he's turned himself around. And meanwhile, he's become dissatisfied with everything he had. So along with his 700 wives, he went out and married or collected a harem of 300 concubines. One little boy mispronounced it, said 300 cucumber vines. I think that's a pretty good explanation because they did indeed tangle up his heart and trip up his feet. Not only was that incredibly selfish, self-destructive, and immoral, it was also spiritually devastating. In fact, God had warned him of what it could mean for him spiritually back there in the first book of Kings, chapter 11. But look at the next sentence. The very next sentence says, that's okay. He didn't listen to that. In other words, he didn't just marry them. He paraded them and flaunted them around without any embarrassment or shame. And it wasn't long before God's words came true, and a hill of shame east of the city of David was to become a place where he would build actual shrines to his wife's false gods. Now this is King Solomon, wise old King Solomon. I think it's all obvious that Solomon had taken his eyes off of the divine book of inspired guidance, and he'd started going his own way. He was upside down, he'd lost track of where he'd been, and he had no clue where he was going. He was running to a fatal collision, and catastrophe is where he was heading. And he slides into his later years an old man without distinction or moral character. Oh, he went through the motions, but his heart wasn't in it. His heart had grown very cold. But it's surprising news to discover that something happened along the way to Solomon. We don't know when exactly. We don't know what it was. But somehow his old, cold heart started turning back towards God. This reminds me of the story that a pastor told once of a man that he used to invite to church every time he would see him. Well, this was a very successful and wealthy businessman, and he said Sunday was his only day off. So he certainly wasn't going to waste it by going to church. Well, unfortunately, he got cancer. And by the time he got the word, there wasn't too much time left. So he reached out to the preacher and asked him to come and talk to him. So the preacher went and visited him, and after a long talk to this what was once a very brave man, who had now been stopped in his tracks and all of a sudden was very interested in what the Bible had to say, the preacher shared with him the gospel, and the man did repent of his pride and all of his sin, and he cast himself upon the mercy of Jesus Christ. Pastor said it was amazing to see the change in this man's life all of a sudden. So quickly he was filled with joy and hunger for the spiritual things, all spiritual things, and particularly what the Bible had to say in the few months he had left. The pastor went on to say, he said, you see, God in his mercy made that man sick and gave him just enough time to think. God is good, and all the time. Maybe even when it don't seem like he's good. We say that every Sunday. Sometimes we got to stop and think, do we really mean that? You see, going back to Solomon, he's now an old man. He's completed all his building projects. He's collected all of his worldly goods, but he's grown bored with his possessions. He's written all his proverbs, but he didn't adhere to them. His body's probably bowed and bent. Maybe his personal physician had given him a message. Hey, dude, you ain't going to live forever. You may have limited time. And it's about that time that they believe he penned the book of Ecclesiastes. I love that book. If you ever read that book, it's full of sarcasm. It's full of pain. But it's also full of profound words of wisdom if you really pay attention to the book. And we're going to hear some of that in our offertory song here shortly. I think the words of Ecclesiastes point out the vanity of things we search for in this life. All those worldly things. When really what we ought to be looking for is what Solomon asked for in the first place. And that is to be able to discern and follow the will of God. That's what it's really all about. You know, and in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, in our song this morning, Solomon says that there's a time for everything. You know, that time is ultimately controlled by God. Not by us, not by kings, not by bishops, not by politicians or anybody else. It's controlled ultimately by God. Don't think so? Well, look at the first one. Actually, it's not the first one, it's like the second or third. He says there's a time to be born and a time to die. Who controls that time? I got news for you. You had zero control over your birth. You don't even remember your birth, as a matter of fact, probably. If you do, please let me know. I'd like to know about that. Now, you could argue that your parents had some control over that, but that's a topic for another sermon that I ain't going to touch. How about death? Well, you know, my cousin Greg Grease and I, we go to the gym every morning, and we work out hard. And the thoughts that maybe we'll add a few days, a few weeks, a few months, maybe a year or two to our lifespan. But we really know that we may not make it out of that parking lot that morning. We know that. You know, I recall a highway patrol display at the state fair this year. It was, they show the remains of a nice BMW that was driven by a young girl. At least it was a nice BMW until she crossed over the center line while looking at her cell phone and she hit a truck head on. Our time is not promised here. We don't know when that time is going to come. And when it does come, often, most often, we are not in control. And I think at his later age, Solomon had come to understand that. Maybe he'd gotten some wisdom. But I think that to understand the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, you got to start not at the beginning, but at the end. It's just like I read novels. When I read a novel, I look at the last chapter first. I want to see if it's going to be worth reading. I mean, Ecclesiastes is one of the few books that actually tells you why it's written. And I think Solomon tells us that in the closing chapter. He says, remember your Creator. He's effectively saying, don't be like me. I forgot God. Don't forget God. Remember your Creator. In fact, remember that you were created. You're not an accident. You're not a mistake. You're not an animal. You were created by a Creator God. A God that you can talk to, you can walk with, you can honor, you can worship as you do today here. And you can look forward to spending eternity with Him. Don't forget Him. Do not forget God. He's wrapping it up by essentially saying that without Him, life is without meaning under the sun. All that stuff you get, and it's getting Christmas time, so everybody be thinking about what you're going to get me. But all those toys, everything you can get in life is meaningless if you don't have God in your life. It's not saying you can't be rich or you can't have things, but it's saying if you haven't got God, it's all meaningless. That's what's important. And get this, old man Solomon is saying here, don't forget God. When? When you're young. When you're young, when you're taking off, when you got life by its tail and everything's in front of you and you're ready to go. That's when you need to remember God. And right now, whoever you are, whatever stage of life you're in, it's time to remember God. You can't wait until it's too late. You can't wait till the end, until the bad news comes or the center line is crossed. It's got to be earlier. My friends, you and I are flying into a culture that is darkened by unbelief and sin, and it's getting darker by the moment. Don't try to fly by the seat of your pants or by your own intuition. You might think you're flying right side up and you're flying the wrong way. At the very end of this chapter, the close of his message, Solomon writes, I think, pretty much what it's all about. He says, when everything is said and done, this is really what it's all about. Fear God and keep His commandments. If you do that, everything will fall into place. That's the whole duty of man. This is how to make life matter. And this is how to avoid the collision and the failure that comes from sin and defiance. Yeah, I think Solomon is saying here to all of us in his book of Ecclesiastes, he's saying, hey, gather around. He says, I'm an old man now. I can't talk as loud as I used to, but listen up. He's saying, I've got words to say to you. And if I could summarize it in the right perspective, He's delivering the most important message of his life right here towards the end of his life. He's going to sit us down in this assembly. He's going to open up his heart to us. He's going to pour out his soul to us. And he's going to tell us there are no platitudes. There's no quick promises. There's no easy answers. And I can't guarantee you're going to understand any of this. Solomon says, listen, I want you to remember. And three things, those 3 points you're supposed to make, right? He makes them. He says that even when life is confusing and seems futile and meaningless and repetitious as life gets, he said, remember, there is a Creator God. He says, even when his plans for your life will at times be mysterious and, yes, even unfair, he says, remember, God has a plan. He has a plan for your life. He has a plan for everybody's life. He has a plan for this world. And then even when all the world is black as night and it offers no hint of sight or help, he says, remember, you can trust in God. So to me, here is Ecclesiastes in a nutshell. No matter how high you soar or how low in the valley your life takes you, you got to keep your eye on the divine instrument of truth. This is the message of the preacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. Amen.